Evening, everybody, and welcome to Keele World Affairs. I've got the pleasure this evening of introducing to you Daniel Bruce, the Chief Executive of Transparency International. Daniel came here, I think, 3 years ago. Some of you will remember him coming on that occasion just after the lockdown. He's the Chief Executive of Transparency International, as you can see from the slide behind you. Transparency International, of course, the well-known organisation that endeavours to shine a light on the darkness, the dark corners of the insidious corruption that we're all so much aware of. Transparency International, I think a lot of you will be aware of it, through the Perception of Corruption Index that they publish each year. It always gets a lot of publicity, I think the back end of each year. And of course, we always look straight away to see where the UK is and see how we're getting on. Disappointingly, we've gone down the league table for the last 3 years, and perhaps Daniel will tell us why that's the case. Somewhat disappointing. But of course, corruption isn't isolated to any individual country. It's a worldwide phenomenon and a very much interrelated phenomenon. And of course, with cross-border finances and so on in the digital world, it becomes an increasingly complex and difficult area to get to grips with. And as corrupt people try to evade the authorities and do the nefarious deeds. Because I was looking at the notes of the talk that Daniel gave on the last occasion he was here in February 2022. And on that occasion, he quoted the Secretary General of the World Trade Organization, who was a woman from Nigeria, and she said, I thought rather interestingly and very tellingly, that countries like hers were perceived to be corrupt, mainly because they were enabled by those countries who weren't perceived to be corrupt. And you can see the perception from countries like Nigeria and some of the other African and Asian countries that are often thought of as being corrupt, but that many of their problems are indeed enabled by the countries like our own that aren't generally perceived as corrupt. So you can see it's a sort of symbiotic relationship between countries worldwide. And I think that's an area that Daniel's been looking at very deeply, the relationship between what we do in our country and how it impacts upon countries around the world. It's something that affects us all, and I'm sure we'll be very illuminated by what Daniel has to say about it. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that warm welcome. Thank you, everyone. It's so nice to be back here. As Ian said, it's almost kind of 3 years to the week that I was last in this very lovely corner of the Staffordshire countryside and in this lecture theatre. But they were different times. I think there were no more than 100 people sitting in this room, and most of the audience was online, because although it was 2022, it was still quite a sensitive sort of post-COVID, during COVID sort of time. So it's lovely to be back here, a real privilege to be asked back and to have such a full house here tonight in normal times. Or are they? Let me try and explore that question through the lens of corruption. Perhaps just a brief introduction to Transparency International UK and our global movement for those of you less familiar with us. We are a global federation of civil society organizations. Some of us are called Transparency International, most of us are, but there are countries with national chapters like South Africa who have an organization called Corruption Watch, and that's our national chapter there. In the UK, our mission is to stop corruption and promote integrity, and I've put our vision, mission, and the ways in which we go about that through advancing policy, improving practice, and promoting change here in the UK. We are politically non-partisan, we're independent, and everything that we do is ultimately driven by forensic, evidence-driven research that identifies corruption problems, corruption risks, seeks to diagnose the specifics of the problem and to propose regulatory, legislative and other solutions to governments, regulators, parliamentarians, businesses, and so on. Now then, I've titled this talk, Corruption, Counting the Cost, and I'm going to attempt to address that rather broad theme through a variety of lenses this evening. Perhaps a simple measure is the cost to business. Actually, in dollars and cents, how much economic harm is corruption doing around the world? This is the most recent economic crime survey data from PwC, who put a price tag of $3.6 trillion annually lost to bribes and stolen money every year, with almost half of all companies that they surveyed experiencing economic crimes, including corruption in some form or another. But as we'll see, and as I'm sure you will agree, corruption is a very abstract thing. It's very difficult to get an exact measure of how much harm it's really doing. And we need to look at it in different constructs, in different countries, and through different understandings, if you like, of what corruption actually is. And perhaps just to ground what I mean by that, I should just refresh us with Transparency International's definition of corruption, which is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. There was a little nuance that we added in there a few years ago, which is that word entrusted, because we recognize that power doesn't always sit in the hands of those who have been elected or chosen to sit in positions of power, but the entrustment of power sometimes manifests itself in a variety of different ways. But anyway, there you go. There's one measure of corruption, the cost to business. I suggested when I was returning in normal times 3 years ago. These pictures depict some of the events that have occurred in the 36 months since I last had the pleasure of standing in this theatre. And in fact, when I was last here, the tanks were amassing on Russia's border with Ukraine. It was probably just days before the full-scale invasion, and I seem to recall that I talked about the problem of the way that oligarchs and kleptocrats from Russia and elsewhere, from autocratic regimes, have been enabled by Western countries, and how harmful this was. And I think the Ukraine conflict is obviously a salient and depressing example of that, and the way that a corrupt regime has been able to go about its business. We now have President Trump, Mark II, with his friends there, Mr. Musk. We'll come back to them later. There was Partygate, and kind of beer and sandwiches feels a little bit small fry compared to some of this stuff now, doesn't it? But it was big at the time. There have been 1 or 2 prime ministers since I was last here, and they've each had their challenges. We now have a new government of a new political stripe, and that's not all been plain sailing. There's Tulip Sadiq in the middle there. She was the nominally called the anti-corruption minister, who had to step down because of a corruption scandal. I'll come on to that later. And we also have seen through some of the research that we've done over the last few years, these kind of pernicious trends in our democracy here in the UK. And I've depicted the House of Lords there, where despite the fact that it has been illegal for 100 years to sell seats in the House of Lords, there is still a conspicuous pattern between the number of people who particularly give 7-figure sums to political parties and curiously find themselves with a peerage not long afterwards. So all of these things have played out in recent months and in the years since I've been here, and I will touch on some of them, not all, over the next 30 minutes or so. Ian's kindly mentioned Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, and perhaps that's a good place to start again with this challenge of counting the cost of corruption and looking at the harm that it's doing around the world and what we think we should do about it. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the CPI, at least in passing, and some of the headlines that it produces every year. But let me just sort of break it down a little bit and demystify what sits behind some of the global rankings. The CPI scores 180 countries at the moment, out of a scale of 0 to 100, where very simply 0 is completely corrupt and 100 is completely clean. It is a composite indicator. It is secondary research that draws upon a wide variety of other expert sources, surveys, and data, for example, from the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and others. There have to be at least 3 data sets for each country in order for us to be able to produce the CPI score. In countries like the UK, we have lots. There's about 11 raw data sets, which then get normalized and put into our blender here in order for it to spit out a score out of 100. It is a measure of the perceptions of experts and industry leaders of corruption in a country's public sector. So the things that it does consider, on the left-hand side of your screen there, are perceptions around bribery, again in the public sector, diversion of public funds, enforcement of integrity mechanisms, prosecution of corrupt officials, and the other features that you see on the list there. Kind of many of the classic features of what we might consider countries with a bigger corruption problem to have. But it doesn't measure those things on the right-hand side: tax flows, money laundering, corruption in the private sector. And I would pull out one of those things that it doesn't measure in particular, because this is important in the context of some of the things I want to talk about tonight. Illicit financial flows, dirty money, the proceeds of corruption from one country that have been captured or stolen that find their way into the financial system and elsewhere in the economy of other countries. I was recalling over dinner before we came over here this evening the rather unfortunate incident when the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, convened a really set-piece anti-corruption summit in London in 2016. He was very genuinely seized by this as a critical foreign policy issue. And you might recall that he was caught on camera thinking that he was off mic before the Nigerian delegation arrived, saying, well, of course, the Nigerians are fabulously corrupt. Nigeria's president at the time said, well, Mr. Prime Minister, if Nigeria is corrupt, you will find that the proceeds of that corruption is in bank accounts in the UK. And that is an unfortunate and slightly embarrassing embodiment of what is a true problem and continues to be so today, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But sticking with the CPI for a second, this map looks horribly orange and red every year, doesn't it? The global trend is that 2/3 of the countries, the 180 where we have data, sit below 50 on the index. So the majority are in a worse state than the minority. You can, of course, see a pattern there, which is that low and middle income countries, and particularly countries worst affected by conflict, those really sort of dark orange countries, fall low in the index, whereas erstwhile stable, mature democracies and richer economies do better. Denmark has been sitting at the top of the index for the last few years. It's usually a battle between the Nordic countries for the top spot, and New Zealand has a fair crack every year. When we look at the CPI, a lot of the media and a lot of stakeholders get terribly excited about where countries sit in the rankings relative to, oh, how's the UK doing compared to France? Are we more or less corrupt than France? Actually, I would say that comparing the rankings isn't the most helpful interpretation of the data. I would suggest that what we should all be looking at is the direction of travel in each country. Ideally, this map would all be light yellow and green, and 2/3 would be, with scores above 50 rather than below, and everyone would be improving. But sadly, that's not the case. Ian mentioned the UK's score. 2 years ago, the UK had a very statistically significant fall of, I think it was 6 or 7 points at the time, but we've fallen 9 points since 2018 to 71 out of 100. That is the UK's lowest score on the CPI since the CPI was invented. I'm happy to get into the underlying data on that later and what's driving that, but I would point you to two things. Global expert views around corruption at the highest levels of government and standards in government and COVID-19 contracts. And these are global views. This isn't what The Guardian or the Daily Mail is writing about. This is the international perception of the UK standing on this index. But zooming out, the important theme that comes out of this, notwithstanding my points about dirty money, which I'm going to come on to, is that a lack of democracy is bad for tackling corruption. Full democracies do score better, with an average of 73 out of 100. Flawed democracies score an average of 47, as you can see there, and non-democratic regimes score an average of 33. Less democracy, more corruption, and that's a trend that has been sustained for a very long time. And again, just look at the underlying data here, which is, frankly, is really troubling. There are only 24 full democracies in that sample of 180 countries, whereas there are 95 countries with non-democratic regimes. So, what are we doing in the UK about these global corruption challenges? We have a new government, still in its first year, and it has committed to some welcome measures and initiatives, which first appeared in a policy speech, which the then Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy gave alongside my Director of Policy at the IPPR just before the election was called, where he announced that a future Labour government would establish a counter-kleptocracy campaign. And in the Labour manifesto, there were actually around 14 commitments, which we were quite pleased with, more than we thought there would be, addressing areas across political ethics and integrity at home, as I've mentioned, reform of political financing, the House of Lords, some of these issues that I've already touched on, and the appointment of a COVID corruption commissioner. Let's stick with dirty money. Again, the proceeds of global corruption from around the world that have found their way into the UK, and the UK's unfortunate reputation as a safe haven for the proceeds of corruption, the dirty assets of kleptocrats and the corrupt who wish to wash their cash and their reputations through British financial services, property, institutions, and to ingratiate themselves into UK society. I think I touched on this research last time, but I do just want to briefly highlight it again, because this gives you a sense of the scale of the problem in the UK. We analysed 400 well-known global corruption cases back in 2019 now, involving around £350 billion of stolen assets from other countries that had eventually found their way into the UK, both in cash and in other assets. And really troublingly, we found that 600 UK companies, institutions, and individuals had played that enabling role to get that dirty money from its source country into the UK economy. Now, there are obvious sectors that are quite exposed here that are more regulated, law firms, banks, and financial institutions. But where we started to see real concerns is in these quirkier sectors, the less regulated sectors when it comes to anti-money laundering and the prevention of the flows of illicit finance. 118 luxury goods and services firms, architectural and interior design companies handling this dirty money, either because they're in sectors that are not used to being used and abused in this way, or, frankly, in some of the law firms we found and some of the banks and financial institutions, because professionals who ought to know better were choosing to look the other way and not ask too many awkward questions about the source of their clients' wealth. So it's a big problem. The National Crime Agency estimates £150 billion of illicit finance flows through the UK every year. David Lammy's counter-kleptocracy plan is intended to address this. I welcome the fact that the Foreign Secretary has a plan. I'm not completely sure yet what the plan is, but it's been talked about much in the last few months. We should have a new national anti-corruption strategy. Actually, we're overdue one by 2.5 years. The last government had just about finished one, then called an election, and as ever, new government wants to put its stamp on, so we haven't got it yet. I hope that the plan will have this plan in it. So what are we seeing thus far in terms of action on this issue? Government is reaching for things that it's already got at its disposal. So there's been a lot of activity around sanctions, both sanctions in the conventional sense, but also using the new corruption sanctions regime. And that the photo of David Lammy here is a video that he produced November sort of time, when through FCDO he announced a load of new sanctions and asset freezes, including this old tube station, Bromley Road tube station in London, which is owned by an oligarch and suspected corrupt individual. So this is not new. Sanctions are important. They're an important tool in the armory, but they're not the single solution. But right now, every time government wants to do something big about corruption, it's going to sanctions. Helpfully, perhaps, for the government, I think we've also got quite an emboldened national crime agency at the minute. And the NCA announced the details of this Operation Destabilize in December last year. And this was an absolutely fascinating case, actually, really quite new, and showed the hybrid threat of corruption and its bedfellows of organized crime and other forms of economic crime. When I talk about the cost of corruption, what Operation Destabilized revealed was how sanctioned individuals, certain Russian elites very closely attached to the regime in the Kremlin, have a direct role in facilitating organized crime on the streets of the UK and washing the cash proceeds of county lines drug gangs, probably not too far away from here, and on many a street corner. The corruption and organized crime that is ruining lives up and down this country, the cash from that being given through complicated networks through the Mediterranean to a highly organized cryptocurrency operation based out of Russia, linked to these sanctioned individuals who are taking the hard cash and pulling it through the Med and turning it into cryptocurrency so that the drugs lords here can't have their nefarious activities detected. And this is all being facilitated through the use of crypto and the gaps in the financial system that we have here. But, again, there you see how global corrupt elites are setting up these machinations that cause real human harm in our own neighborhoods. 84 people were arrested, £20 million worth of assets were seized. I hope we see more such action in the future. What we'd like the government to do on the dirty money issue, weeks after I spoke here last time, I think that the then Conservative government actually found itself quite embarrassed about the dirty money problem, which we and others have been pointing out, and many parliamentarians for some years, because at that time, there was much tough talk on Russia and sanctioning Russian assets. So it was a bit awkward that there are some really nice properties in West London that are owned by sanctioned individuals, and that there was a system that allowed that to happen. And so we've had two bits of economic crime legislation in the last couple of years that's designed to close down some of those loopholes that has allowed this to be the case. So, for example, when I last spoke to you, it was perfectly legal to own property, to be an offshore individual, to own property in the UK completely anonymously. And this was the classic playbook of the oligarch. There is now a piece of legislation that prevents that, and the true beneficial owner of property, whether UK resident or otherwise, now has to be transparent, makes it harder for people to stash their dirty assets here. However, that law has a loophole in it. If you own your house through a trust, you can still do it anonymously. We did point this out to government at the time, and it got really stuck with the government lawyers. There's been a long, grinding consultation on how to fix this problem, and various complex legal arguments that I won't get into as to why why that loophole shouldn't be shut down, but what we're seeing is some nefarious service providers advertising this lacuna in the law to people who've got something to hide. I don't think I could do that for a job and sleep at night, frankly, but there we go. The other big problem we have is our offshore financial centres, the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies, and I could talk at a big system level about this, but I don't have time, so I'm just going to say British Virgin Islands, because the British Virgin Islands are, by a country mile, the biggest contributor to the use and abuse of opaque shell companies that then are used to funnel dirty money into the UK. And of course, that has huge implications around tax fraud and tax evasion and other crimes. Again, going back to David Cameron's 2016 campaign, that was the beginning of the global beneficial ownership transparency campaign, the principle that you can't anonymously own an asset because that can be used and abused for nefarious purposes. And years ago, the overseas territory said, yes, we're going to open up our secrecy jurisdictions, and they haven't. And now we're stuck in this back and forth with them about what are called legitimate interest access registers. So if you're a journalist, if you're a regulator, law enforcement, or legitimate civil societies such as us who are going looking for stuff, then we might let you see it. And the BVI is currently consulting on its plan for a legitimate interest register, which MPs across the House have described as shameful. Their proposals are worse than it already is. If journalists from the Financial Times, under this proposed regime, goes off to the BVI and says, can I have details on this person? The regime, the BVI, will tip off the person that is being investigated to give them the heads up that this is coming. I mean, it's ludicrous. And also, the problem with legitimate interest access is you've got to know what you're looking for. Much of our research, which shows the scale of the problem with this, is system-wide. And it's really important that it's fully open to be able to do that. And another thing that we'd like the government to get a move on with is reform of the anti-money laundering supervisory regime. Again, I'm getting into weedy technical stuff here, but this is important. Lots of those companies that I referenced earlier, those sectors, have got this massively fragmented landscape of toothless regulators overseeing them. So again, there isn't a disincentive there to not break the money laundering rules because it's not being supervised and enforced properly. And we've got strong agreement across civil society and the private sector around simplifying and strengthening that regime, which we hope to make some progress on over the next few years. I just want to come back to sanctions, and again, the title of my talk, The Cost of Corruption. This is Isabel dos Santos. She's the daughter of the former president of Angola, who led the country for 37 years. She's accused of systematically abusing the positions that she happened to get given at state-run companies and of embezzling at least £350 million of state assets to increase her personal wealth, and therefore depriving Angola of the resources that it needs for its own development. She has been subjected to an Interpol Red Notice since 2022, and she lost a case at the Court of Appeal at the end of last year regarding her worldwide asset freeze. She furiously denies the allegations against her, but she is subject to a whole range of legal actions now in an attempt to get some of the assets that she and her family have profited from, to put it politely, from the resources that should belong to the Angolan people back to the people that rightfully own them. And she was on that list of sanctions that came out just before Christmas. Again, there are other things that the new government is doing on anti-corruption policy. We have a new anti-corruption champion. We haven't had one for 3 years. Baroness Hodge is taking on that role. Interestingly, and this is really getting into the sort of parochial stuff around what does corruption look like in the UK, there's also been an announcement of a new domestic corruption unit housed in the City of London Police, which will seek to better coordinate intelligence on domestic corruption and look at high-risk sectors, border force, prisons, and so on. Again, the NCA estimates that there's a sort of low low hundreds of thousands number of petty bribery offences in the UK every year, yet the number of prosecutions that you have for them, I can count on one hand. So definitely more to do there. I've mentioned the anti-corruption strategy that we need. And there's been some tinkering from the new government on parliamentary standards after some of the political scandals that we've seen on recent years. Slight strengthening of the PM's ethics advisor, for example. And whilst we would like to see much more substantial reform of the House of Lords, and particularly House of Lords appointments, for reasons I pointed to around donations, what we've got so far is citations for new peers. So when somebody does get a peerage, it has to be transparent why they got it. There are reasons for that area of interest, which I'm sure your imagination can take you to. I'm going to talk about political financing in a second. It's not all been plain sailing, though, has it? There's Tulip Sadiq again. I'm sure you saw this on the news a few months ago, but basically her aunt was Sheikh Hasina, who had ruled Bangladesh since 2009 and fled after a popular revolution in August of last year. And again, here you have allegations of a family dynasty ruling a country, initially perhaps with a popular mandate, but then over the years, a sense that that country's wealth is being corrupted by those in charge, that there were growing and high levels of corruption in public institutions, and in the latter years of her regime, that there was increasingly really harsh stifling of any dissent or any criticism of the Hasina regime, and a particularly disturbing pattern that those who objected to it were being, quotes, disappeared. Now then, Tulip Sadiq was quite a young woman when all of this was happening. She got given a flat in King's Cross by a prominent donor of the Hasina regime 20 years ago. But then, just before Christmas, Tulip Sadiq herself was named in the scope of allegations that the corruption commission in Bangladesh was now investigating against the former regime. One can take a view on how politicized or not some of those investigations are. This does happen when there's a sudden revolution and change of power. But then the National Crime Agency here started to get involved as well because of the links between the regime, Sheikh Hasina's family, and assets in the UK. And it started to become about more than one flat. Very rarely for us, with our colleagues in the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition, we called for the minister to at least relinquish her oversight of the anti-money laundering regime that was her bit of the anti-corruption portfolio as the city minister. We did not think it was tenable for there to be a minister overseeing an anti-money laundering regime that she herself may be investigated under, or members of her close family. In my 5.5 years in this position, we've never done that. I mean, we've seen some interesting things happening in Westminster, but because this was so specific to our mission and so specific to delivering on anti-corruption commitments, we felt we would be conspicuous by our silence. She resigned later that day. Keele's gear, glasses, trousers. I don't know, there's a lot of political mischief around this. I put this in the category of stuff that gets given to politicians, and most of the stuff that gets given to politicians is cash. Donations for them and their campaigns, and donations to political parties. And when you look at the hundreds of millions that has flowed into our main political parties in Westminster over the last few years, the cost of some fancy suits and specs rather dwarfs into comparison. But it is an issue, and we need reforms, which I would mention this gentleman, the chap in the middle. It was all smiles then, because Mr. Musk was touting the prospect of giving $100 million to reform UK. And there's two problems with that. First is that our view is that big money in UK politics has a corrupting influence, full stop. We have advocated for years for there to be a £10,000 cap on political donations in the UK. The biggest donation previously given to a political party was £15 million by a gentleman called Frank Hester, who gave some money to the Conservative Party. You might remember he got embroiled in a bit of scandal himself over things he'd said about Diane Abbott. And that itself showed why, if you have a big donor giving to a party, and it turns out they're going to cause some trouble for you, why big money is problematic for our politics. But $100 million, what's that, 75-ish million pounds? That would have dwarfed that already very sizable donation in terms of the record donation. But more to the point, it's not in the spirit of the law. People who are not on the electoral register in the UK are not allowed to donate to political parties, and with good reason, because it protects our democracy from malign foreign influence. But you had Musk and others, and I stress our political impartiality here. I would be saying this if it was the Green Party proposing to do the same thing, or Labour or the Conservatives. You should not have members of that party saying, oh, we're going to find a way to run it through the kind of corporate loopholes in the system. And we're going to game the system a bit. No. I was astonished at some of the commentaries and some of the, frankly, weak journalism. They didn't say, hang on a minute, is that legal? Because it's certainly not within the spirit of the law. Anyway, they've had a falling out, haven't they? So I don't think that's happening now. But it's been a wake-up call, certainly for the current administration, to get on with the business of reforming political donations. And why is this? This all happened very serendipitously in the first week of December when we published a report called Checks and Balances, which found, among the following findings, I'm not going to read them all to you, you can find the report online if you want to read it in full, but I'll pick out those two first bullet points. 10% of all political donations over our 10-year survey period came from either unknown or questionable sources, again, with links to global corrupt regimes and individuals in that sample. And this is the point on corporate donation. £10.9 million came from companies who hadn't made enough profits in the UK to pay for the donations they were making. So they're foreign donations. They're not UK donations. That's not allowed, but it's a gaming of the system. Big money corrupts our politics, and it means that if we intend to have a representative democracy and to preserve a representative democracy, that is only going to be threatened by those who've got big checkbooks, who want their own personal private interests to corrupt the policy agenda of our politicians. Look at what Musk has done in the US since he got given this Doge role by President Trump. Obviously, lots of news comes out of the US overnight, every night. But a few weeks ago, Mr. Musk, the world's richest man, shut down, literally overnight, the world's largest humanitarian and development operation in the form of USAID. Now, I'm sure there's a wide variety of views in this room on the merits of aid and development budgets and how they're spent and if they're spent on the right things. But is that really the way to go about business, shutting it down overnight with literally no notice whatsoever by somebody who's been given immense power because they have a big checkbook? Nobody voted for him. Now then, I'm going to swiftly move on to another theme, which is close to my heart, mindful of the clock. I mentioned one of the things which came through the UK CPI score was, in the underlying data, a perception that from global business leaders and experts that public money in the UK was being diverted because of corrupt practice. So not necessarily bribes being paid, but there's been a corrupting of the system. And or that large government contracts were being given out to people who were friends or donors of the party of government. And I would hypothesize that this concern centers on a lot of the drip of scandal that we saw around COVID-19 contracts. And in September, we published our second and final report on this topic, having analyzed 5,000 PPE contracts forensically, every single one of the contracts that the UK government gave out for PPE. So we now have a data set that is bigger than the government itself has on its own public spending. This report was called Behind the Masks. This is a slightly nauseating slide because it has my head on it too many times, but it gives you a flavor of the media attention. My comms team very kindly put this together for me. This was the media interest in Behind the Masks all on one day back in September, where we found, having looked at this sample of 5,000 contracts, that 135 of them had red flag, 3 or more red flags for possible corruption. We had a list of 14 that we'd developed, 14 red flags that we'd developed in line with best practice from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and then sifted this big 5,000 sample against these 14 red flags. Now, you might say, well, 135, that's not many. But of the £45 billion that was spent by the UK government on PPE, those 135 contracts made up £15 billion of that spend. So it's a third, with not one, but three or more red flags. Now, one or two, it can be procedurally explained. Some of these have got 8 or 9 red flags, and I think the worst offenders were those where you would, for example, see a company that had been set up overnight, less than 100 days old, nothing on its balance sheet, happened to be connected to a political donor, got referred through the so-called VIP lane for political referrals of contracts, itself found to be unlawful by the High Court. Said company got, hundreds of millions in contracts, and then either delivered equipment that was completely useless and not fit for purpose and wasn't delivered at all. This has been a lightning rod issue for the public. It really has, and I welcomed the attention to our findings, and we've shared the list of 135 with the relevant authorities for further action. I raise it today because next week, firstly, because I call this talk Counting the Cost of Corruption. £15 billion is a lot of money. I'm not suggesting all of that was corruptly awarded, but it's certainly a lot that's worthy of investigation, and there's a lot of learning that needs to come out of the UK's experience with COVID-19 contracting. We didn't find anything like the VIP lane anywhere else in the world. It's completely unique to the UK. Colombia and Ukraine were publishing all of their COVID contracts within 24 hours. There are £5 billion of COVID-19 contracts in the UK that still have not been published to this day. It was a systemic disaster. And you will hear a lot more about that next week, because the procurement module of the COVID-19 inquiry begins. And with our friends in the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition, we have core participant status in that module, and usually we're also witnesses as well. And as of about 3 o'clock this afternoon, I'm now permitted to share with you that I will be appearing as a witness at the inquiry on Tuesday afternoon. So I'll have plenty more to say on that topic then. I hope you might catch a bit of it on the inquiry's feed if you're interested. So hopefully I've given us a bit of a sprint through the different ways that corruption is costing us, both around the world, the relationship between full democracies, flawed democracies, autocratic regimes, and corruption, but importantly, the links between the slightly old-fashioned perception of corruption as being something that happens in faraway places with less democratic institutions and checks and balances, and rather understanding that all too often the proceeds of that corruption can be found in bank accounts in the UK, and that there is still so much work to do to protect that, and an important defense against some of the geopolitical uncertainty that we are all living through at the minute is strengthening our own democracy and protecting its defences from corruption, either through nefarious donations that corrupt our politics, or by having governments and politicians that people trust because they subject themselves to high standards of integrity and behaviour. There's a little shopping list on the screen of things that we would like to see. I have covered, I think, pretty much all of them already. So I will wrap up here with a few thoughts. There is a screenshot of the homepage of our new website, which looks really nice. So please do take a look, transparency.org.uk, and there you will find all of the publications and research and analysis that I've referred to this evening, and plenty more besides. I'd love you to sign up for our newsletter, where you can receive regular updates from us as well. We're not in normal times, are we, as I fleetingly suggested at the start of this lecture. And my guess is as good as yours as to where many of the geopolitical fault lines are going to have us land in the months and years ahead. What I think I would say with some confidence, though, is that the norms and the standards and frameworks that the likes of us at TI, like-minded governments and institutions, the norms and standards and frameworks that we have been able to rely on for decades are being shaken like they have never been shaken before. I'm not sure that they will survive and come back in the same way. And I think we are going to need, with allies and like-minded democracies and countries, rebooted norms and standards and frameworks to protect our countries from the corrosive impact of corruption. You see from my COVID-19 testimony that when huge amounts of public money are flowing around in an emergency, how corruption is waiting at the door to take advantage of that. And we have a European continent that is now suddenly planning to spend huge amounts of money on rearming itself. Denmark last week decided that it was going to scrap a large chunk of its defense procurement rules in order to buy stuff fast. It's not a good idea. We have to do this properly, and we have to learn from past mistakes, because we know that corruption ultimately fuels poverty, it fuels inequality, it fuels the insecurity and the destabilization that we're seeing. And it keeps dictators, kleptocrats, and plutocrats in their seats of power without justification. There's plenty we can do, but we ignore it at our peril. Thank you.